Hey, in this video I want to demonstrate some Unreal Engine 5 tips and tricks for beginners, some workflow speedups, hotkeys, and so on. Now I'll make a separate video for blueprint tips and tricks, otherwise this video will be very long, so you'll notice a lack of blueprint tips in this video. To begin with, I will talk about asset editor tabs and how we can specify where we would like those to open, so we can have those open in a new window or in the main window, for example. We can go to Edit and Editor Preferences. Then we have the section here. You can search for this as well if you want. Asset Editor Open Location. This is in the user interface subsection. So we can click this drop down and then we can specify where we would like to open Asset Editor tab. So for example, if we open up a blueprint or a material asset, for example, it's going to open up that editor tab or window. Now it can be annoying if you have to dock that tab each time. So the editor asset opens up and you have to dock that to the main window each time. So to save some time with that, we can specify here that we would like that to dock in the main window, for example. Now let's say I open up the blueprint underscore horror character, for example. That tab will now get docked in the main window. I can set that to new window. And if I open that up again, I can just press Ctrl Spacebar to bring up the content drawer. You can see that is going to open that up in a new window. That's useful if you have another monitor, for example, and you want to bring that over. We can also specify the content browser. So I will go to Window, Content Browser, and bring up a new content browser here. Maybe you have that set to a second monitor, another monitor, for example. And now each time we open up a new asset editor, we want to dock that tab wherever we have the content browser. So we can specify the content browser in here as well. And now if I open up some asset editor tab, such as that horror character blueprint again, it's going to dock that wherever we have the content browser open. Again, very handy if you have multiple monitors for your workflow. Now, since we have the editor preferences open, I'd also like to talk about the grids in the blueprints and the material editor, for example. Personally, I find that a bit noisy. So what we can do is we can go to graphs in this section and then we can enable or disable use grids in the material and blueprint editors. And as you can see, if you have that toggled off, this looks quite clean. You don't have those grids in the background. I actually kind of prefer this. Sometimes your actors might be rotated slightly, or the surface that you want to place them on might be rotated slightly. So of course you have the option end, so you can press end and that will snap to the floor. However, you can also left click and drag on the pivot point. So on the center of that movement handle, you can see you have that white handle. So if you left click and drag on that, that is also going to allow you to snap to the surface wherever that pivot is. Now if we have the snap to surface option enabled, we actually have this drop down here and we can click to rotate to surface normal as well. So I will enable that. And now again, left click and drag on that pivot handle, on that pivot at the center of the gizmo. And now you can see that as it snaps to the floor, it's actually going to rotate and orient that to the floor as well, to the surface normal. We can actually also do a surface offset. So if you don't want to snap directly to the floor, we can do a bit of an offset. And now you can see this is going to hover slightly above the surface. So sometimes the surface that you want to actually snap to, so your floor, for example, may not be entirely flat, such as we can see here. If I just use the handles, it's not going to snap to that surface, of course. So again, we can left click and drag on the pivot point handle basically. And as you can see, we can now snap the actor to the surfaces which are at an angle. And when you are moving around using WASD and right mouse button to look around, it can be a bit difficult to focus in on where you want to go when you are working with a particular actor. Now, of course, as you are navigating or as you are left clicking and dragging, right mouse button clicking and dragging as well, you can scroll the middle mouse button to slow down the viewport camera. If I make big changes to the speed of the viewport camera, I prefer to click on this button and make the changes in there. But specifically when I want to focus on a particular actor, when I want to rotate around it, inspect it and so on, I prefer to use the Maya style navigation. Firstly, we want to focus on the actor by pressing F for focus, or we can go to the outliner, mine is to the left here, and we can double click on that actor as well. That will also focus on that particular actor in the level. Now we can use the Maya style navigation, so press and hold Alt, left mouse button, click and drag to rotate. Alt, right mouse button, click and drag will zoom. And Alt and middle mouse button, click and drag will pan. I prefer this method again when I'm trying to focus on inspecting a particular actor in the level. This navigation method also works in other editors such as the Blueprint editor, in the Viewport tab, and also in the Static Mesh editor, for example. So we can move an actor constrained to an axis by left-clicking and dragging on the particular handle, X, Y, Z, or the planar handles between those. Now we can actually also constrain to an axis in another way, and that is with the actor selected and with the Translate tool active. Press and hold Control and left mouse button to move the actor constraint to the X-axis. Pressing and holding Control, right mouse button, click and drag to constrain to the Y-axis, and again Control, right mouse button and left mouse button together to constrain to the Z-axis. We can toggle between the Move, Rotate and Scale tools with the spacebar, so we don't have to click in the Viewport toolbar each time to change the tools. Okay, so with the Rotate tool active, we can press and hold Control and left mouse button, click and drag to rotate about the X-axis. Okay, Control and right mouse button to rotate about the Y-axis, and then Control and left mouse button and right mouse button combined to rotate about the Z-axis. When we move an actor using these tool handles, we can press and hold Shift, left mouse button, click and drag on a handle, and as you can see, this is actually going to move the viewport camera along with that constraint to the actor. We can press and hold Alt and then click and drag on one of the handles on the gizmo, and that is now actually going to create a copy. Okay, so that's a fast way of creating copies. Okay, so I can just press and hold Shift and left click the other cones here, and with all of those selected, again, now I can press Alt and Shift, so I'll combine these, Alt and Shift, and then left mouse button, click and drag on one of these handles on the gizmo, and now I create a copy, but as I move those, the camera is going to follow. Now this is great because I don't have to move the camera each time, so reposition the viewport camera, move the actor a bit, reposition the viewport camera, and so on. One more shortcut, let's say we have this cone and this cube, and I want to copy the transform location from the cone and paste that onto the cube. And so instead of having to copy the entire vector one by one, so X, Y, and Z, those values, we can copy that property value. Same thing with materials and some of the other properties as well. But let's look at the location here, for example. We can see that we have the shortcuts, Shift, left mouse button, Shift, right mouse button. So again, instead of having to right click for the context menu, clicking copy, what we can do is we can press and hold Shift, right mouse button to copy, click on the cube, Shift, left mouse button to paste the location. And now those have the same location. When we move our actors in the level, we have a toggle to enable grid snapping, so we can snap the actors to a grid. Now we have preset steps, so if it's 50, that's going to move at a 50 centimeter increments. Now here we don't have something in between 10 and 50, for example. So let's say we want to set an in-between value, a step of 25 units, for example. Go into the editor preferences. Under viewports, we have this grid snapping section. You can also just search for that. Then under this decimal grid sizes, I can expand that and click the plus button to add an additional step. To the left here, we have this handle. So I can left click and drag on that to place that where I want that step to be. Back in the level editor, we can now see that that step shows up. So I can set that to 25 now. And now as I move and snap my actor to the grid, it's going to snap in steps of 25 units. Next, I want to talk about type 2 search. This can be a bit of a speed up if you are a keyboard user. We do have some search fields, so for example, if you use the file menus, the right-click context menus, and so on, as well as some of these menus, such as where we click to add to the project. So you can either click in that search field, but that's one additional click that you can avoid by simply beginning to type what you want. So cube, for example, I will type that out, and then we can drag that into the level. So again, I don't have to click in that search field. I can just click where I want, and then I can type to search for what I want. So in the file menu, for example, start typing, save. Same thing in the content drawer, control space to bring up the content drawer, right click, make sure the mouse cursor is off of that context menu, because otherwise if it is in one of those submenus, for example here in the blueprint, if I start typing, you will see you may not find what you're looking for. So with the mouse cursor off of that menu, I can just start typing. I don't have to click at the top to start in the search field. I can just start typing, and then I can use the arrow keys if I need to navigate that menu further. For example, enumeration, I will type that out, and I have an enumeration. I don't have to go from one menu to the next, navigate the menu to find that. Same thing with the level. Maybe I want to add a new level, and so on. Instead of opening up the content browser and searching in there for a blueprint or some other asset, for example, we have this option in the file menu, open asset, that is Control P. So I'll just press Control P in here, and then I will type BP underscore, for example, to search for some blueprint, such as, let's say I'm searching for this blueprint horror character, or this horror light, for example. I can just drag and drop that in. So that's handy. I don't have to open up the content drawer and search for that in there. Just a quick way of searching, finding an asset. That's also why it's important to name your assets appropriately. So let's say it's a blueprint, for example. You do a prefix of BP underscore. Maybe it's a material instance. You do MI underscore, level, LVL underscore, and so on. Because whether you're searching in the find assets pop-up here or in the content browser, those prefixes will save you some time. We can also bring up a list of open assets and tabs by pressing Control Tab, and then we can navigate that by simply hitting Tab again, or you can click on what you want to open. Don't forget about filters in the content browser. So this button right here, we can select which filters we want to have active. Then we can click on those to toggle those on and off. Static mesh, for example, I often have the level or the blueprint filter available so that I can toggle between those. We can also set the color of a folder. So blueprints, for example, I'll right click on that, and then we have this option to set the color for that folder. So again, right click on it, set color, and I will change this to red, for example. I'm just kidding, I'll set that to blue. Okay, so change the color in here and click OK. And now as you can see, that shows up in this blue color in the content browser. We also have a favorite section in the content browser, so we can right click on a folder and then click to add that to the favorites, and that will then show up in there. So a quick way to get to your favorite or most used folders. With an actor selected, we can actually just jump to that asset in the content browser. This is useful if you want to find that particular asset for editing. Maybe it's a blueprint, for example. So with that actor selected, we can press Control B to jump to that asset in the content browser. Instead of browsing to the asset in the content browser or content drawer, you may just want to open up that particular asset directly in a static mesh editor, blueprint editor, or whatever the asset is. For that, we can select the actor again in the level and then simply press Control and E. And again here, that is going to open up this jump pad over here, and then a similar thing with a static mesh. So if you have a static mesh selected, it's going to open up that asset in the static mesh editor. A blueprint will open in the blueprint editor, and so on. There's a quick way to find the materials or assets, such as the static meshes and such, that make up our actors. For example, I will select this actor, go into the details panel, and let's say I want to browse to the material asset that is applied to the actor. I can click on this button right here that represents a folder with a magnifying glass. Click on that, and that will browse me to the asset in the content browser. With the asset selected in the content browser, I can now apply that material to another asset, such as the logo here, for example. I will select that actor, and in the details panel in the material section, I will click this arrow button right here, and that is going to apply the asset that we had selected in the content browser. And we can edit the preview thumbnail of an asset in the content browser. So here to begin with, I will go to the settings by clicking this cog button here at the top right. Then I'll go to thumbnail size and I will set that to large or extra large so we can see those a bit more clearly. Then I'll go to settings again and then I will enable this thumbnail edit mode. Now I can left click on the thumbnail to rotate that around, and if I want to revert that, I can click on this revert button. When I'm happy with that, I can click done editing. An asterisk will show up, so we can just click save all here to save that. And that's how we edit the preview thumbnail of assets in the content browser. Sometimes we have placeholder assets in the level that we want to replace with other actors. Now, instead of going in and deleting and replacing each one of those individually, we can select all of the actors and replace them with the asset that we want. For example, let's say we have these placeholder cubes and I want to replace those with this cow static mesh. So with the cow static mesh selected in the content browser, I will go and select those cubes, pressing and holding Shift, left click to select each one of those. Again, I'll just make sure that that cow asset is selected in the content browser. Then I can right click on one of the cubes, so one of the selected actors, and that's important because we don't want to lose our active selection. So again, right click on a selected cube, and then in this replace selected actors with, we have a few options. We have a recently placed section, and we have this selected section. So SM_tinycow, for example, that is the one I have selected in my content browser. I'll go and select the static mesh, and as you can see, that now replaces all of those cubes in the scene. We can frame selected actors in all viewports. For example, let's say I have a quad layout with some orthographic views, left, right views, and so on. And the actor that I want to work with, maybe it's a wall piece that I want to place precisely, and it does not quite show up. Now, of course, we can navigate around in those orthographic views and such, but there's a shortcut for that. We can press Shift and F, and as you can see, that is now going to frame the selected actors in all of those viewports. We can select all actors with the same static mesh. For example, I have these cows in my scene, and maybe I want to select all of those. Instead of having to press and hold Shift and left click each one of those, I can simply select one of them and then press Shift and E. And again, that is going to select all of the actors in the level with the same static mesh. We can rotate the directional light. There's a shortcut for that. Pressing and holding Ctrl L, we can move the mouse around and set that rotation to something that we like. Now we can do something similar in the asset editor windows, such as the static mesh editor, the material preview window, and in the blueprints editor. In the viewport tab, we have this preview light in those editors. We can press and hold L and then a left mouse button click and drag to rotate the light that we have in there. We can capture bookmarks. So here in the level editor, for example, let's say we are working on different areas of our level and we want to switch back and forth. Well, we can capture a bookmark right here by pressing Ctrl 0 to 9, for example. So here I'll just select 1. So Ctrl 1. And then I'll navigate to a different area of my level. Let's say I'm working over here. Maybe I'll capture a bookmark over here as well. Ctrl 2, for example. And so now if I want to go back to where I have captured one of the bookmarks, so the previous one, I'll just press 1 on the keyboard and that's going to jump back. And now my viewport camera is focused on those actors where I had it bookmarked previously. Press 2 and that's going to take me to the second bookmark that I had captured. So again, this is useful because we don't have to now navigate between those two different areas in the level. We can simply press 1 and 2 to switch between those two bookmarks. We can click on the camera options drop-down to access those bookmarks. So right here we have those bookmarks. We can set a bookmark right here. You can also see the shortcuts for that. And we can jump to a bookmark. So I'll just click on this one here, for example. Go back into that menu. And we have Manage Bookmarks. So here we can clear the bookmarks, clear all. So we can clear specific bookmarks or we can clear all bookmarks. We can also capture bookmarks in the blueprint editor. So over here at Begin Play, for example, I will press Ctrl 1 to capture a bookmark, Ctrl 2 to capture a bookmark over here. Then to navigate to those bookmarks, we press Shift and the relevant number, so Shift 1 for example, Shift 2, and again this speeds up navigation in the blueprint editor in the graph here. We can click on this button to add a named bookmark. I'll just name this one Begin Play for example. Then I will navigate to Window and Bookmarks to bring up the bookmark window. Here we can double click on bookmarks. Notice that we also have the comment section, so recover meter for example, double click on that, it's going to navigate to that. So comments is also very handy because it shows up in the bookmarks tab. Double click on begin play again, and that is going to bring us back to this bookmark that we have set here. We can enable a translate widget, which also allows for rotation so that we don't have to switch around. So each time you move the actor along a bit, you want to rotate, move, rotate. This means we don't have to switch or toggle between translate and rotate gizmos each time. So we navigate to editor preferences, level editor, viewports, under the look and feel section, and then enable this. Enable combined translate/rotate widget. I'll enable that. And now we get this translate widget, which also has this rotation handle, so we can rotate about the z-axis. Again, this is useful if you want this type of widget where you can move your actor around, rotate it slightly, move it, rotate it slightly, and so on. This also works with the rotation snapping, so press and hold Control, left mouse button, click and drag on that handle, and that gives you an angle increment for rotational snapping. You can free up some space on your drive by removing the projects and asset packs that you are not using in your library. Here, for example, in the library, we can click on this drop-down right next to Lyra game, for example, that I have downloaded, and I can click Remove Local Content. So that will remain in your library, and then if you want to create a new project from that, or if it's an asset pack, if you want to add that to a project again, what's going to happen is it will simply have to download that again before it will actually create a project, or if it's an asset pack, to then add that to your project, to your chosen project. Often when we add asset packs to your project, they come in with a bunch of stuff that we are not necessarily going to use. And so you end up bloating your project with a bunch of unnecessary assets. So what I prefer to do is to create an asset dump project. That's just what I call it here for demonstration, but you can name it what you want. And so with this project, if I download some asset pack and I want to add those assets to a particular project, I just dump all of those into this specially created project. Then from that project, we can migrate or export only the particular assets that we actually want to use in our working project. So with this Niagara example pack, I have that downloaded, so I'll just click Add to Project, and then I will select my asset dump project, and I will add that to the project. And then from that project, I can go and export or migrate what I want to my working project. So here in the asset dump project, I have found maybe a static mesh that I like. So I can right click on that in the content browser, go to Asset Actions, and then I can export or migrate that. I will click on Migrate, and this will copy all the selected assets and its dependencies to another project. So here I'll just click to save, and then here it will show you the assets that will be migrated to another content folder. All we have to do is to select the content folder of the project that we want to migrate these assets to. We can toggle the visibility of an actor. The shortcut for that is H. And if we want to isolate an actor so that we hide all of the other actors in the level, you may want to select a light before you do that, such as the directional light. I'll select that in the outliner, go to visibility, and then select show only selected. Maybe frame up on it, use the milestone navigation to rotate and move around that, Control L for the directional light. And then we can show all actors again with Control H. And of course we can toggle the visibility in the outliner by clicking on this visibility button to the left of the actor. It might be useful to group actors. You can place them in a folder if you want. So in the outliner, for example, with those actors selected, I will right click, move to, and I will create a new folder. Now if I toggle the visibility by clicking the visibility button next to the folder, the visibility of all of those actors will be affected. It also allows us to quickly select all of those actors if we want to move all of them. So that's one way of doing it, but we can also group actors. With the actors that I want to group selected, I will right click on my selection and then I can select group. The shortcut for that is Ctrl G to group. With those actors grouped, you will notice a green bounding box around those. And so now if I select one of those actors in the group, it will select all of the actors. It's going to select the entire group. And if I move using the movement widget or the rotation handle, for example, that transformation is going to affect the entire group. With the group selected, we now have the option to unlock the group. So I'll just right click and go to groups, and then I will select unlock. So now we can left click and select individual actors within the group, maybe make some modifications to their transform. So I'll rotate some of them around, for example, maybe move some of them around. When I'm happy with my changes, I can simply right click again and go to groups. We have the option to remove an actor from a group. In this case, I'll just select lock to lock the group again. And now again, if I translate or rotate the group, that is going to affect all of the actors in the group. There's also a shortcut to ungroup, and that is Shift G. We can also snap to vertices. So I'll just make sure to get the actor as close to the other actor that I want to snap to, for example. Then I will press and hold V for vertex snapping. You'll notice the vertices highlight in a blue color. I will drag on the handle to snap. You also have this option in the snapping dropdown. Click to enable vertex snapping, and as I drag, you will see those vertices highlight, and I can snap. Sometimes the pivot is not quite where we want that. It's useful to place the pivot where we want it. For scaling, rotation, let's say it is a door hinge, for example. So here in this example, I can scale from this bottom location to scale this wall up, or from the side here to scale in that way. Or maybe I want to rotate my actor in this way. So being able to place the pivot where we want that is important. Okay, so we can press and hold Alt and middle mouse button click where we want to place the pivot. This is going to offset the pivot. Now notice that if I lose my selection and I select my actor again, the pivot is going to revert back to its default location. I can also right click where I want to place that pivot and go to the pivot menu and click Set Pivot here. Now to prevent that pivot offset from reverting back to its default location each time, we can right click, go to Pivot and Set Actor Pivot Offset. Now if I select another actor and I select this actor again, that pivot offset is going to stay there. When working with pivots, I prefer to isolate the actor or the actors that I'm working with. For example, I will select the actor that I want to set the pivot on. So in this case, this wall piece here. And because I want to isolate this in the level, I also want to select a light, such as the directional light. Then I will right click and go to my visibility section and select show only selected. And that is going to isolate the directional light and this wall piece here. So now I can work with this pivot. We can middle mouse button click and drag on the pivot as well to move that around. Now we can snap the pivot to a vertex. Now before I continue, I usually turn off grid snapping just to make it easier to work with. And as I mentioned, I also prefer here to isolate the actors that I'm working with. Alright, so I'll press Alt and V and then I will middle click and drag on that pivot. And now I can snap that. Maybe I want to set the pivot offset to one of these bottom vertices so that I can rotate from that position. Now we don't want to lose that when we deselect the actor again. So right click, go to the pivot menu and select Set as Pivot Offset. Now you have to be careful with this because if you drag with the middle mouse button and then you do Alt V, that could create a copy of the actor. I'm not sure if that is a bug in the current version of the engine, but just look out for that. So again, press and hold Alt V and then move your pivot where you want that to snap with the middle mouse button. And Ctrl H to unhide all of the actors. Now it's important to note that this is an offset, so it's not going to affect the pivot of the static mesh. So for example, the pivot is right over here where we set that, but if I navigate to that asset in the content browser and I drag in another instance of that, notice that the pivot is still where it was originally. We can reset that offset, so I'll just right click here to bring up the context menu go into the pivot menu, and then we have this option reset pivot offset. And as you can see, that pivot now snaps back to its original position. Now there is actually a way of modifying that pivot on the static mesh, and we'll look at that next. Traditionally, if you wanted to modify the pivot point of the static mesh, you would have to go into a DCC application such as Blender, for example, and then modify that, set the pivot where you want that, and then re-import that asset. But we no longer have to do that in Unreal Engine because we have the modeling tools. So with this asset, for example, the pivot is at the center of that, and maybe I want that to be at the bottom, and I don't want to add an offset. I actually want to modify that pivot so that each time I drag and drop that asset into my level, the pivot will still be at the bottom of that static mesh. To do this, I will switch to the modeling mode, and in the XForm section, I'll actually just pin this modeling tab here. I will click edit pivot, and then we can edit the pivot. So we have these handles, so we can move it around. And we also have this box position section, which will place the pivot following a bounding box. So I'll select bottom, and that's going to place that at the bottom of my asset, and I will click accept. It's important to note that this will edit the asset, so you may want to create a duplicate of the asset before you actually commit these changes. So with that done, I will switch back to select mode here, go into the content browser, drag and drop an instance of that into my level. As we can see, that pivot is now at the bottom of my asset. It's often the case that the pivot is not exactly where you want that is with asset packs and so on. So this is a way of setting the pivot point without having to round trip to other applications. We can combine multiple static meshes into one. So this wall section, for example, I have two pieces here. And maybe I decide I want to combine those into one mesh so that I can reuse those and just drag and drop that asset into my level. I will select all of the actors that I want to compose into a static mesh. I click on this actor menu and select convert actors to static mesh. Now I have to give that a name and specify the location, and then we can click save. I'll just go to that location in my content drawer here, and I can drag that out, and that is now a single static mesh. This is also useful with the assets that come with the editor, such as these cubes and spheres and so on. For example, let's say I want to make a quick tree to populate certain areas of my level with. I can just drag in a cylinder and a sphere, and I can select both of those actors, and then I can go again to actor, to the actor menu, and click convert selected actors to static mesh. Let's look at a few more shortcuts. I can right click on an actor and select move camera to actor. And as you can see, my viewport camera now jumps to where that actor is. In a similar way, I can right click on an actor again and move that actor to the camera. Okay, next let's talk about piloting. We can pilot an actor, and then we can navigate the viewport to place that actor where we want it. That is particularly useful for lights such as the spotlight, and also for cameras. For example, I have this spotlight in my scene, so I'll right click on that spotlight and click here to select pilot actor. We have a shortcut for that to pilot the selected actor, that is Ctrl-Shift-P. Now, whilst piloting the spotlight, I can move around as usual, so WASD and right mouse button, click and drag to look around, just as we can with the viewport camera. And as you can see, now I am moving that spotlight around, and I can basically point it where I want that to light my level. We have this button to stop piloting, or basically to eject from that. We can also use the camera options menu, so we can switch back to the perspective view, for example. I'll just click this button to stop piloting that. Next, I will add a camera actor to my level, drag one in. Now I want to pilot that to perhaps get a nice shot of my level to take a screenshot from or something like that, create some cinematic. So again, I will pilot that actor, navigate around in my level until I'm happy with where that is. And what's useful with the camera actors is that we can use the camera options menu. So those will show up in the camera options menu. So I can toggle between perspective. So I'll just switch to perspective here. We get a camera preview window. And then I can simply go back when I want and switch between camera and perspective again. And I can go and click on the camera actor again to pilot that. Or what I can do is I can go to the movement pilot subsection, And then we have that camera actor in here as well. So I can click on that to pilot that camera. I'll just click this button to eject from that. Now, of course, we can also pilot other actors, such as static meshes. So I'll right click on this cow here, for example, and pilot that, move that where I want it to be by simply navigating my level, and then eject from that when I'm happy with where that is. Alright, so that is a quick look at how we can pilot actors. With a camera selected, notice that we get this preview window. Now we can actually change the size of that preview window. With the camera selected, I will go to the camera options window. And down here we have the option to enable or disable the preview window. And then we have this camera preview section with the preview size. So I can just left click and drag in here, enter a value for the size. That is also in the editor preferences. Under level editor, viewports, we have those settings here. So preview selected cameras and the camera preview size. Of course, you can just search for that. And that is how to enable or disable the preview and how to change the size of that preview window. We can lock an actor's movement to prevent it from being moved. So this camera, for example, maybe I want to prevent it from being accidentally moved. I can right click on that, go into the transform section and click to toggle this lock actor movement. And now you'll see the movement gizmo disappears. And in the transform section, also notice the location, rotation and scale is grayed out. We can toggle the light radius indicators. For example, I will select the lights in my scene and notice that we get these radius indicators that clutter the scene, and we may want to toggle those. We can toggle those with the shortcut Alt-R. That toggle is available in the Show Flags dropdown, so we'll navigate to that. In the Advanced section, right here, that is the light radius. Sometimes we want to see what our level will look like in-game, that is without the billboard sprites, as we can see here, for the player start, for example, and the lights, volumes, and so on. Again, we can toggle game view or game mode with G, and as you can see, if we press that, that is going to hide the billboards and the volumes and so on. Now the viewport is only going to render what would be seen in game. Okay, so that's a toggle, so you can press G again to bring those back. We can press F11 to toggle full screen mode, and so that is going to hide your details panel and all of that. And this is particularly useful also when you want to play your game, so then you can press F11 to maximize your viewport or to set that to full screen. We can click this button to simulate the level. Now this can be useful to inspect physics simulations, AI, and so on. Okay, I'll play the level. That is Alt-P, shortcut for that, Alt-P to play the level. Now you'll see we can press Shift F1 to get the mouse cursor back. You can also press F8. Now F8 is actually going to eject. So I'll just press Shift F1 here. Now get your mouse cursor back. We can pause and resume, we can stop, and we can click this button here to eject as well. So that is going to eject the viewport camera out of the player pawn, so the current player camera basically. And so now we get the viewport camera, we can navigate around, and then we can simply repossess that, or we can press F8 again to repossess and to get that player camera back. So I've created this project using the first person template with the horror preset. And often what happens is you have this level open, and now we have to open up yet another level so that we can actually, play the level that we want to play. Well, we can actually set what map and game mode and everything we want to have open when we open the editor, so when we open this project. So for example, we can go to Edit, Project Settings, and then in the Maps and Modes section, we can define the editor startup map. It's currently set to this first person map. I want to set that to LVL_horror for that horror map. And same with the game default map. We can also set the default game mode, the top section. And if we click this drop down, that is going to set all of these things such as the default pawn class, the player controller class, and so on. So I want to change that as well. I want to set that to the BP_horror game mode, for example. And with that set, the next time I close the editor and open that back up again, I'll just save all before I close. open the editor back up again, and we can see that that now opens that level, the horror level. I can just begin with my work. This is especially useful if, of course, you only have a small amount of time to spend per day when you're trying to stay consistent with your game development, but you only have, maybe half an hour or an hour to actually try to get something done. All of these small speed ups will add up over time. If you are running on a laptop or maybe older hardware, or in my case when I'm recording videos, I don't really care about the graphical fidelity all that much, especially when I'm just working on game mechanics. So in that case, we may want to reduce lag and increase the frame rates or FPS in the viewport. Well, firstly, we can go to the performance and scalability options, and here we can toggle off real-time viewport, and then we get this button here as well that will basically warn us that says, well, real-time rendering has been turned off. If you click that, it's actually going to toggle that back on again. We have a shortcut for this. We can press Ctrl R to toggle real-time. Again, this is useful for performance-intensive scenes. Now you may want to see the current frames per second in the viewport. We can toggle that by going to this View Flags menu, and then under the viewport stats, we have this. These are options here, a few options. I'll just enable FPS, and now we get the frames per second. We have a shortcut for this. The shortcut to show the frames per second is Ctrl-Shift-H. Okay, so if you don't want to go into that menu, maybe you remember the shortcut. That is Ctrl-Shift and H. In the performance and scalability options again, we now have a few options for viewport scalability. It's currently set to epic. You can click on the auto button to let Unreal compute the most suitable settings, or you can choose the settings yourself, so clicking on low, medium, high, for example, or epic, will set all of those in the column to that particular setting. Click on medium, for example, and it will set all of those options to medium. And that basically doubles my frames per second. So I actually typically set that to medium when I'm just working on game mechanics, for example. You can also toggle specific things such as global illumination, or set that to low, reflections to low, shadows to low. That should also make a difference, and then you can set the other settings to higher quality if you want. I'll just turn that off. Now we'll also get a button that basically warns us, that says that those options are no longer set to their default values. And as I mentioned, you can just click those buttons and that will then revert those options. So you don't have to dig for those in the menus again. We can also show the application frame rate and memory in the main editor title bar, that is right next to the menu bar, by going to the editor preferences. Okay, navigate to the performance section. In the editor performance subsection, we can enable show frame rate and memory. Okay, we have that toggle right here. So with that turned on, the frame rate and memory usage will show up in the editor title bar. We can also change some of the project settings if we go to Edit Project Settings, and we navigate to the rendering section. And then under the reflection method, this is set to lumen. We can change that to screen space or to none, for example. That will also save you some performance. Same with global illumination. I'll just set that to none. So again, just a few considerations if you're having some performance issues. Next, I want to show you a quick way of changing your perspective viewport to a side view or a top view, for example. So we do have this button here to show all of the viewports. We get this quad layout, for example. And then we can maximize and minimize those specific ones that we want to work in. We can change the particular view from top view to bottom view and so on. Just go back to the perspective view here. And now what I can do is I can press and hold Control and drag the middle mouse button in the direction that I want to go. So let's say I want to go to the top view, for example. I can press and hold Control, middle mouse button, drag up to go to the top view, for example. Press and hold Control, middle mouse button, click and drag down to go to the bottom view, right to go to the right view, left to go to the left view. Control middle mouse button, click and drag diagonally to go back to perspective. I'll just go back here to the top view, for example, because another thing here is that we actually can measure by pressing and holding the middle mouse button, just middle mouse button by itself, click and drag, and we can measure. This measuring also works with the grid snap sizes. And remember, we have this drop down, so we can just go back to perspective here as well. We can save our layout. So here I'll just go and make some modifications to my layout. Maybe I will dock the content browser, put the outliner where I want that, maybe dock the output log as well. Then I'll go to Window, Save Layout as. I will give that a name and a description. And maybe at some point I close off some of these windows, some of these tabs, and I want to load my layout again. I can just go to Window and load that layout. We can place an actors panel. So here I'll just click on this drop down and select Place Actors Panel. And here we have those subsections. We have lights, shapes, and so on. What's nice about this is that we can right click and then we can add those to a favorites section. And then in the favorite section, those will show up. So we can just drag in those actors from this panel. And we can right click on the tab and we can dock that to the side. And we can pin that when we want to use it and so on. Very handy panel when you are blocking out your levels. A bonus tip, in the view mode settings, we can switch the viewport to Unlit, which is going to render the scene without lights. So this is useful. As we've seen before, we can set the visibility and isolate an actor in this way. And so with this, we don't have to also isolate a light source. Unlit mode is very useful for when you are blocking out your levels. Sometimes we are in dark rooms or in dark corners where we do not yet have light set up. So again, Unlit mode is very handy for that. Alright, so you've worked on your level for a bit and now you want to show that to friends and family, maybe post it on social media or maybe share progress with fellow developers. Well, a quick way of capturing a screenshot from the current view is pressing F9. You should get a pop-up at the bottom right corner of the editor that will show you where that is located, so you can just click on that or navigate to that location. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, as we can see here, because I don't have game view enabled, we get box collisions, we get the billboard sprites will also show up and so on. And of course, we may not want those in our screenshots. So press G for game view. And you may also want to maximize the view by pressing F11. You can also take a screenshot by clicking on the camera options drop down. And then at the bottom of that menu, you have capture high resolution screenshot. Before I do that, I'll show you a few things that I like to do. So one thing I like to do is to add a camera in my viewport. And then as I set up that particular area that I want to capture, well, I can either place a bookmark in that area, or I can place this camera. And then I can use this camera options menu to switch between the perspective viewport and the camera that I have placed in the level. This means I can continue working in the other areas of my level. And when I'm ready to capture the screenshot, I can simply switch back to that camera actor. When we select that camera in the camera options menu, we essentially pilot that camera, meaning we can use the navigation as we are familiar with, WASD, right mouse button, click and drag, and so on to navigate around. Again, as we would in perspective view, we can click this button to stop piloting the camera, maybe add some particle effects to our shot, or whatever it is that we want to do. And then when we are ready to take the shot, we can simply switch back to the camera actor and then go to that high resolution screenshot option and click capture. And remember, you may want to set your viewport scalability settings to higher quality, perhaps epic or cinematic if you want to take high quality screenshots. And so with that, we are going to wrap up this video on tips and tricks for beginners. I hope you have found this useful. Again, I will do a separate video on tips and tricks for blueprints. So thanks for the support, guys. I will see you next time.